This is Silent Valor, where hearts meet courage. Subscribe now, and thank you for giving me your support. With just one click. Under the scorching Nevada sun, rifle shots cracked and faded into silence. At 1,700 yards, the steel target still stood untouched, mocking the young Marine snipers and their state-of-the-art gear. Then, across the dusty range, an old man appeared. Silver hair, weathered boots, a faded field jacket, and a long cloth-wrapped rifle slung over his shoulder. Sergeant Morrison's voice cut through the heat. "You don't belong here, old man." But the stranger's eyes fixed on the wind flags, his voice calm, steady, and low. "You're not fighting one wind out there. You're fighting three." The Nevada desert shimmered beneath a merciless sun, the air heavy with heat waves that bent the horizon into a trembling mirage. Sergeant Jack Morrison stood at the firing line, sweat dripping down his square jaw. Morrison was tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped dark hair and a scar running diagonally across his cheek, a relic from a roadside explosion during his second tour in Iraq. That scar shaped his character. It made him impatient, harsh, and deeply intolerant of weakness. He barked orders with the conviction of a man who believed discipline was the only path to survival. His Marines lay prone with sleek rifles, their brows furrowed in frustration as bullet after bullet fell short. Technology, ballistic computers, rangefinders, all useless against the swirling chaos of desert winds. Morrison clenched his fists, pride stung by failure when the silence broke. An old man had stepped past the perimeter wire. Earl Whitaker looked like a figure forgotten by time. Jeans faded almost to white, a field jacket bleached by sun, and eyes pale blue as winter ice. His silver hair framed a face carved by years of hardship, yet there was a stillness in him, a calm that unsettled Morrison's soldiers. He carried a long cloth-wrapped rifle, its weight steady in his hands. Morrison's voice was sharp, brittle with authority. "This is a restricted range, old man. Leave. Now." Earl did not flinch. His gaze lingered on the rippling flags, reading them like scripture, then shifted to Morrison. His voice was low, calm, almost weary. "You're not seeing the air, son. You're only seeing what you want to believe." Morrison's jaw tightened, a tremor of anger rising, but before he could respond, one of the younger Marines, a lanky boy with freckles, suddenly whispered, "Sir, I think he's right." Earl Whitaker's calm words still hung in the dry air as the young Marine's whisper from the last moment left Morrison bristling with fury, his pride raw and exposed. Morrison squared his shoulders, his sharp scar tightening as he sneered. "You think a pair of old eyes can outmatch $10,000 of equipment? Don't insult my men." Earl, unfazed, adjusted the strap on his cloth-wrapped rifle, his weathered hands steady, his gaze fixed not on Morrison, but on the restless shimmer above the sand. Behind Morrison, a new figure emerged from the observation tent, a civilian contractor named Dr. Richard Lowell, a wiry man in his late 40s with thin blonde hair receding at the temples, his round glasses slipping down a narrow nose. Lowell was a data specialist, hired to validate the performance of the Marines with his tablet and sensors. He believed in numbers and dismissed human instinct, often mocked by soldiers as the machine's prophet. He smirked at Earl, his voice nasal and laced with superiority. "Sir, wind is measurable. Science does not bend to old campfire tales." The young Marines exchanged uneasy glances, torn between loyalty to their gunny and a growing curiosity about the stranger. Earl finally turned, his voice a deep rumble. "Science is only as good as the man reading it. You're staring at screens, not the world. Out there the desert is talking and you're deaf," Morrison snapped, stepping closer, his breath hot with anger. "If you're so wise, prove it. Show us you can do better with that antique of yours." The soldiers froze, anticipation knotting in their chests, as Earl slowly placed the rifle case at his feet. He began to unwrap the faded cloth with deliberate care, and the first glimpse of aged walnut wood caught the sunlight, just as the sound of approaching engines rolled like distant thunder across the desert. The engines in the distance grew louder until Earl Whitaker's steady hands pulled away the last fold of cloth, revealing the Remington M40. Its walnut stock was worn smooth, bearing deep scars that whispered of battles long past, and the steel gleamed dully beneath the desert sun. Sergeant Jack Morrison let out a sharp laugh, his scarred face twisting with contempt. "That belongs in a museum, not on a Marine range," he sneered, his voice heavy with the arrogance of a man desperate to shield his pride. Dr. Richard Lowell pushed his glasses higher on his nose, his thin lips curling into a condescending smile. "I doubt it even fires straight anymore," he muttered, already entering data into his tablet as if to erase Earl's presence with statistics. The young Marines watched in silence, their eyes flicking between their gunny and the old stranger, unease prickling in their chests. Earl's gaze turned inward, his pale eyes glazing with memory. Suddenly he was no longer in the Nevada desert, but back in the choking humidity of Vietnam. At 19, his frame lean and hardened by survival, he lay in the mud, face streaked with grime, heart pounding like a drum. Beside him had been Private Lucas Hayes, a boy no older than 18, with sandy blonde hair and freckles that disappeared under layers of dirt. Lucas was a joker, always cracking smiles to mask fear, but that day, his laughter had been silenced by the stutter of an enemy machine gun. Earl's fingers had wrapped around the same M40, its stock slick with rain, a fresh gouge carved by shrapnel. One shot, one breath held, and he had saved his platoon from certain death. The vision faded, the desert heat pressing down once more. Earl's eyes sharpened, grounding in the present, as the convoy of military vehicles screeched into view, dust spiraling high into the sky, doors already swinging open. The convoy's dust had barely settled when Sergeant Jack Morrison, his pride burning hotter than the desert sun, barked an order for the MPs to restrain Earl Whitaker. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowed, and the scar across his cheek seemed to deepen as his anger boiled. The young Marine who had spoken earlier, now identified as Lance Corporal Tommy Reynolds, could no longer endure the injustice. Reynolds was 21, lanky with wiry arms, his reddish-brown hair always falling over earnest green eyes. He had grown up in a quiet Kansas town, raised by a mother who taught him fairness was worth more than strength. With his stomach knotted, he ducked behind a Humvee and pulled out a battered cell phone, the kind that had scratches across its screen from being dropped too often during field drills. His hands trembled as he called the armory. On the other end answered Master Gunnery Sergeant Philip "Phil" Carver, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with graying stubble and a voice like gravel. Carver was a legend in logistics, known for keeping entire battalions supplied in Afghanistan's harsh mountains, and he had a protective streak for anyone wearing the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. Reynolds spoke quickly, his voice low, describing how Morrison mocked and threatened Earl, and how the old man had revealed an M40 rifle older than anyone on the line. Carver fell silent, his usual humor stripped away. "Did you say Whitaker? Earl Whitaker?" Reynolds confirmed, and the sound of a chair scraping violently echoed before the line went dead. Minutes later, in the command building, Colonel Robert Hayes was pulled from a tedious budget meeting. Hayes, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and a commanding presence, had eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. But when Carver whispered the name Earl Whitaker, his face drained of color. Without hesitation, he slammed the file closed and growled, "Get my vehicle now. We're heading to the range." The colonel's aide scrambled to obey, and as Hayes strode from the room, his voice carried like a verdict. "No one lays a hand on him. Not now. Not ever." The desert air trembled with the roar of engines as the convoy screeched to a halt, dust swirling high into the sunlit sky. Marines stiffened instinctively, their rifles lowering as the doors of 2 black Humvees and a police cruiser slammed open. Colonel Robert Hayes emerged first, tall and imposing, the desert wind tugging at his immaculate uniform. His salt and pepper hair was cropped close, his eyes sharp steel gray, the kind that had seen too much combat yet carried an unshakable authority. Every step he took across the gravel seemed to draw the air tighter around the range. Beside him strode Sergeant Major Daniel Coleman, a man in his late 50s built like granite, with a bald head glistening under the sun and a jaw set in permanent discipline. Coleman was known across bases for his uncompromising standards. Stories told of recruits breaking down under his gaze, though those who endured spoke of his fairness and loyalty. The younger Marines whispered nervously, exchanging glances as the 2 highest-ranking men on the base walked past, without a word. Jack Morrison froze, his bravado draining, a flicker of doubt flashing in his scarred face. Earl Whitaker stood motionless, the Remington M40 resting in his hands, his pale eyes unwavering. Hayes stopped directly before Earl, ignoring Morrison as though he were invisible. He raised his hand in the sharpest salute the Marines had ever seen, his voice booming. "Chief Warrant Officer Earl Whitaker, sir. I apologize for the conduct of my Marines. It is inexcusable." The air thickened with stunned silence. Morrison's jaw slackened, his chest heaving with confusion. Coleman stepped closer, his shadow falling over the gunny, his voice low and edged like a blade. "Sergeant Morrison, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" The question hung heavy, but before Morrison could answer, Hayes turned back toward Earl, his gaze steady, and said, "Sir, I will need you to demonstrate for them, here and now." The range fell into a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to hesitate as Earl Whitaker lowered himself onto the mat, the Remington M40 cradled in his weathered hands. He moved with slow precision, lowering his body until his cheek pressed against the scarred walnut stock, every gesture deliberate, practiced, and unshaken by the weight of dozens of eyes upon him. Colonel Hayes stood at parade rest behind him, his steel-gray gaze steady, while Sergeant Major Coleman folded his massive arms, his expression unreadable. The Marines clustered near the firing line, their breaths caught, each one trying to decipher the calm of a man who seemed carved from the very desert itself. Earl spoke as if lecturing a classroom, his voice gravelly but steady, pointing to signs only he seemed to read. The shimmer above the rocks at 1,000 yards, the grass bowing toward them near 1,500, the deceptive flicker of the flag at the target's edge. "You're not shooting through one wind," he said softly. "You're shooting through 3. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, sweat gathering at his temples, his earlier bravado dissolving under the weight of what was unfolding. Among the Marines was Private First Class Henry Alvarez, a broad-shouldered young man of Mexican descent, his short black hair sticking to his forehead. Alvarez had grown up in El Paso, raised by a single father who taught him respect for the old ways, and now his dark eyes widened with something close to reverence. Earl's gnarled fingers squeezed the trigger, the crack of the rifle splitting the stillness like a thunderclap. Time held its breath for 2 long seconds before the crisp, ringing echo of a bullet striking steel rolled back across the range. Dead center. The Marines erupted in cheers, disbelief turning into roaring respect. Hayes nodded once, his voice firm as stone. "From this day forward, Mr. Whitaker will be your instructor in the language of the wind." Yet as the applause thundered, Morrison's fists clenched at his sides, shame twisting into something darker, and his eyes burned with the beginnings of a decision that could shatter everything. Weeks passed beneath the blazing Nevada sun, and the range that had once echoed with frustration now hummed with focus and patience. Earl Whitaker sat cross-legged on the sand, the scarred M40 resting across his knees, while the young Marines formed a half-circle before him, notebooks open, rifles slung casually as they listened. He held up a single blade of grass, letting it flutter between his weathered fingers, explaining how it whispered more truth than any digital screen. Even Morrison, once seething with pride, now sat quietly at the edge, his scar catching the light as if reminding him of the battles he had fought both inside and out. He watched, absorbing the old man's words, shame softening into humility. Among the Marines was Private First Class Henry Alvarez, who had once doubted his own instincts. Now he leaned forward, eager, his broad shoulders tense with respect. Earl's lessons were not only about wind and bullet paths, but about listening, to the world, to one another, and to the silence within. On a late Saturday afternoon, the desert light fading into gold, Morrison found Earl again at the small hardware store in town. The aisles smelled faintly of soil and fertilizer. Earl, in his worn jacket, studied seed packets with the same patience he had shown on the range. Behind the counter stood Mary Dalton, the shop owner, a kind woman in her early 60s with graying auburn hair tied neatly, laugh lines deepening around her eyes from years of cheerful service. She watched the two men quietly, sensing a change in Morrison's demeanor. Morrison approached, his broad frame almost hesitant, and said, "Mr. Whitaker, thank you. You've given me back something I didn't know I'd lost." Earl smiled, gentle and grandfatherly, tapping Morrison's shoulder as he nodded toward the tomato seeds. "Remember, Gunny, it's all about giving them room to grow." The shop filled with Mary's soft laughter, and for the first time, Morrison laughed too, not bitterly, but with relief. The war between pride and wisdom was over, and in its place stood respect, gratitude, and the beginning of a bond that would outlive them both. In war or in everyday life, the greatest lessons are not always written in manuals or measured by machines. They live in the quiet art of listening, to the wind, to the earth, and to the wisdom carried in each heartbeat. Thank you for staying with us through this story. May your days be filled with strength, peace, and kindness. If this touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of silent valor.